everyone.
Yeah.
How did you like our warm-up cowboy music? So, we had to talk about horses a couple of weeks ago, and Joanna was back there. They found CDs with horse music. Now we really like it. We're going to play it at every program. Thanks for coming. My name is Penny Wright. I know many of you. And many of you know today's guest, Tom Clavin. Some of you don't, so I'll tell you a few things about him. He's a best-selling author, and he's worked as a newspaper and website editor, a magazine writer, TV and radio commentator, and a reporter for the New York Times, covering entertainment, sports, and the environment. He has received awards from the Society of Professional Journalists, Marine Corps Heritage Foundation, and National Newspaper Association. 3 previous books have been New York Times bestsellers: The Heart of Everything That Is, Halsey's Typhoon, and The Last Stand of Fox Company. Other recent titles have received popular and critical acclaim, and they include The DiMaggio's, Last Men Out, Gil Hodges, Roger Maris, and Reckless, The Heart of Everything That Is. The Heart of Everything That Is being developed as a feature by Ridley Scott Films. Fox Company has been optioned and is being adapted for the big screen, and Last Man Out is being developed as a 10-hour limited series by the Levinson Fontana Production Company. Tom's latest projects are Lucky 666, The Impossible Mission, which was published by Simon & Schuster last October, and Dodge City, the book he's here to talk about today, which was published by St. Martin's Press in February of this year, became an instant New York Times bestseller and has had screen rights snapped up by Amblin Entertainment. Good news. So please join me in welcoming Tom Clavin.
Thank you, everybody. My mind started to drift there during all that. I got to get back in focus. I just want to preface things just very quickly by one of those phew moments that was just a couple of days ago. I opened up my email, and I opened up one, I didn't really recognize it, and it was the first sentence is, my name is Charles Masterson, I'm 80 years old, and I am the grandson of Bat's brother Thomas, and I just finished reading your book. And I go, uh-oh. But thankfully he went on at some length about how much he liked the book, and brought back a lot of stories he had been told by his grandfather and other family members about his, I guess it would be his great uncle, Bat Masterson. So that was a bit of good news that he lives in the Dallas area. So he said, if you're ever down in Dallas, and I got all kinds of memorabilia. So I wish I'd known him 3 years ago. I don't. Some of you may have seen me give a talk before. I'm not a fan of just sitting here and reading to you, because you certainly have the ability to read yourself. And mostly I just want to tell you the story of the book and some stories from the book. There'll be a couple of exceptions, and I'm just going to read a couple of 2-3 paragraphs from the prologue, not the whole prologue, but a couple of paragraphs. And then when I'm done with my talk, I will read the very last paragraph of the book, and then there is a very strong connection between that first paragraph and the last paragraph. So let me just start off with that. This is from the prologue to the book Dodge City. On a gleaming bright morning in early June 1883, Bat Masterson was on a train bound for Dodge City. When he disembarked there, he expected to be greeted by Wyatt Earp. Neither man knew for sure, but they had a pretty good idea that whatever was to transpire that day, there were already national headlines about the, quote, Dodge City War. It could mark the last time they would walk the streets side by side as men determined to do what was right. It was very likely that each would go a separate way, pursuing the myriad possibilities the American West offered, or, on this day, their luck would finally run out. The train, its plumes of puffing steam dissipating in the wide blue sky and the dust-dried air of the prairie, traveled on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line. This was the railroad company that had done the most to connect the Kansas cowtowns more than a decade ago, and had made Dodge City, especially, the keystone not just of Kansas, but of the entire frontier. Bat had a fondness for trains. He had traveled on a lot of them since he and his brother Ed had first come to Dodge City and labored to lay tracks for them. They had been buffalo hunters and skinners then, and still teenagers. Both had become lawmen in Dodge, and his brother had died as one, gunned down by cowboys, who then had to face Bat and his blazing six-shooters. 2 years earlier, Bat had been on another train to Dodge City, arriving just in time to prevent his second lawman brother, Jim, from getting bushwhacked. Now, once again, Bat might have to step off with his pistols primed for sudden action. As Bat's train pulled into the station, he had to have mixed feelings about returning to Dodge City. He had told a newspaper reporter that Wyatt was, quote, the best friend I have on earth. And so he had to be looking forward to seeing him again. But he knew that corrupt tub of lard Larry Deeger and his ilk were waiting for them. Gunplay was never Bat's first option, nor Wyatt's, but the scoundrels who had taken over the city might have different intentions. When Bat stepped off the train, he had an ivory-handled 6-gun on each hip and a double-barreled shotgun in his hands. Wyatt waited for him along with Charlie Bassett, Frank McLean, Neil Brown, and several other men wearing pistols. Bat was curious as to the whereabouts of Doc Holliday, who he knew had joined Wyatt in Kansas City. But with the men already here, and this was just a reception committee, likely there were more in town, there was plenty of firepower. Wyatt and Bat greeted each other. Though different men physically, Wyatt tall and slender, Bat of average height and stocky, their grins were the same, indicating pleasure to see each other, even though the reunion was to settle a matter that might risk their lives. Then they set off, natural leaders, the rest of the men flanking them, starting down the dusty streets of Dodge City, ready for one last showdown to preserve the peace. So that's how the book begins. And it was a mention of the Dodge City War. I don't know if anybody has heard of the Dodge City War, but I was researching something else. The Heart of Everything that is had gotten published 4 years ago, I guess, 2013. And it was quite successful, and I wanted to do another book that had some kind of connection to the American West in the 1860s or 70s. And I was trolling around, and I didn't have anything immediately in mind, and I didn't want to do something that had been done many, many times before. So I was looking around, and I saw a mention of the Dodge City War, and the description of it was that it took place in 1883, as the first sentence tells us. It was in June 1883. And it was when Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson reunited as lawmen in Dodge City to rescue the town from the bad guys who had taken it over. They had left Dodge City in a good place, with a peaceful place. And then several years later, the town, a very corrupt and violent element, had taken the town over again. And so the word went out, to let's find Wyatt wherever he is, find out wherever he is. And Wyatt recruited Doc, and they got some of their other guys and old lawmen colleagues together. And they all rendezvoused at Dodge City with guns ready, because they were going to settle the hash of the bad guys and return Dodge City to the way they had left it originally, years earlier. So what I found fascinating was that what was the first time they had been in Dodge City? And they must have been very young men. And as I found out, they were only in their 20s. In fact, I think Bat Masterson was only 23 when he was elected sheriff of Ford County, in which Dodge City resides in Kansas. And so I wanted to go back. I wanted to find out about their origins. Most of what we know about Wyatt Earp is more, most people have name recognition of Bat Masterson. And some of us remember the television show with Gene Barry, the bowler hat and the cane and everything. But a lot of people have name recognition but don't exactly know who was Bat Masterson. What did he do? Was he a lawman? Was he an outlaw? Was he a theatrical producer? Was he a newsman? Was he a cowboy? Was he a buffalo hunter? He was all the above and more, as I found out. Most of us are more familiar with Wyatt Earp, and the main way that most of us are familiar with Wyatt Earp is because of his portrayal in the movies. And he's been portrayed as a character in the movies at least since the 1940s. And one of the things I found out is, A, most of these portrayals, Gunfight at Corral, things like that, are not accurate. Whoever was directing or writing the script would move the pieces around to suit whatever story they wanted to tell. And the other thing is, Wyatt Earp was almost always played by that point, actors who were middle-aged. Henry Fonda played him in My Darling Clementine. Burt Lancaster in Gunfight at the OK Corral. Even more recent efforts, you see Kurt Russell in Tombstone. You saw Kevin Costner in the film called Wyatt Earp. But when Wyatt Earp was in they're portraying a Wyatt Earp in the Tombstone days, the Gunfight at the OK Corral days, when he was a little more mature, experienced lawman who was often portrayed as a guy who knew what he was doing, knew what the right side of the law was, and acted accordingly. And that was not the Wyatt Earp of Dodge City. That was not the Wyatt Earp that emerged, from the American frontier. That was the Wyatt Earp I was interested in. I wanted the Wyatt Earp who was only in his 20s. I wanted the Wyatt Earp who was in prison for buck horse stealing. Who knows that? So that's why I went back in time to try and find out about the earlier Wyatt and Bat, how they got together, how they became best friends, and their first real experience in Dodge City of cleaning up a town a decade before Tombstone. So in Wyatt's case, he was born in Illinois. He was one of 10 children. There were 6 Earp brothers and 4 Earp sisters. A couple of them did not survive to adulthood. His father was kind of a rascal. He was a moonshiner. He would alternate. One year he'd be a moonshiner and be behind bars. The next year he'd be a justice of the peace. There was a very thin line between good and bad, the black hats and the white hats in those days. He was always moving his family around. They were always on the road. During the Civil War, Wyatt's 3 older brothers, including Virgil, who was his next oldest brother, who he was closest to, served in the Union Army. And when Virgil got back home to Illinois, to the farm, he was kind of restless. He said, I need to get out of here. I need to go. I want to explore what's out there in the West. And he took Wyatt, who was only about 17, with him. Off they went. And they went out to Arizona, New Mexico, California, Nevada. They became freight haulers, stagecoach drivers. They would go to mining camps, whatever work needed to be done. They did this for a couple of years. And then decided, let's go home and visit Ma and Pa. Let's see if Pa's in jail. And so they went back, and by this point, the family had settled in a place called Lamar, Missouri. And that's where they found what was the rest of the Earps, the younger Earp children, were still with the parents. And they decided to stay for a while. It was a very pretty town that was rebuilding itself after battles, Civil War battles. And Wyatt was saying, I'll stay here for a while until I decide what to do. And what happened to Wyatt was he fell in love. There was the daughter of hotel keepers, Orilla Sutherland. He fell in love. The feeling was reciprocated. They ended up getting married, and he bought a plot of land for $75 with a house on it. And he was appointed a constable in Lamar, Missouri. And Wyatt saw himself, this is going to be my life. I'm going to be a decent man here in this town. No more traveling for me. I shook that dust off me. I'm going to have a family here, and this is the rest of my life. And that was his intention until shortly before his wife's due date, she died, and the baby died with her. And he sold off the land, and he was grief-stricken, and he started wandering, gradually making his way further west, getting into trouble. He was arrested for this crime, for that crime. The worst of it was he and another guy stole horses, and people might think, well, it's Wyatt Earp, he was probably a railroader. No, he was a horse thief. And he got caught, and he got thrown in prison, as he deserved to be. And if something hadn't changed at that point for Wyatt Earp, if we know his name at all today, it could be because he became one of the most notorious outlaws of the American West. But when he got out of prison, he wandered around some more, and he basically ended up, after a quick stop someplace else, in Wichita, Kansas. And he had a brother there, a brother and his wife, and so he had at least someplace I'll stay out here for a bit. And just for a couple of unusual circumstances, he ended up, the sheriff, the marshal there, appointed him as a deputy. Wyatt seemed to be a guy who could take care of himself, who had another thing about Wyatt is that he did have somewhat of an imposing demeanor. He was 6 feet tall, and today 6 feet tall would not be somebody who stands out. In the early 1870-ish, that was probably about 6 inches taller than the average male height at that time. So he was taller than most men. He had cool blue eyes, very piercing blue eyes. He was somebody who didn't say much. He always kept a cool head under pressure. The Marshall noticed that in a couple of confrontations. So this is a good man, I think I'd like to hire him. And one of the reasons why Wyatt didn't drink You know, we have the image of the Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday knocking back drinks at the Lone Star Saloon or something like that. Virgil had tried to introduce Wyatt to alcohol when they were doing their travels together, and a couple of times Wyatt tried it and became violently ill. And he said, what am I doing this for? So he never, for the rest of his life, Wyatt was not a drinker. He had the occasional half a glass of beer, but coffee was his drink of choice. So he got hired in Wichita, and I should mention very briefly, one of his stops before Wichita was he became a buffalo hunter. Now in those days, buffalo hunting was a disgusting, I mean, any day buffalo hunting is a disgusting job. It's not like manufacturing is approved buffalo hunting. But you had to find the buffalo, you had to kill the buffalo, you had to skin the buffalo, you had to separate the parts and the skin and everything like that. It was disgusting, dirty, smelly work. But for a young man like Wyatt Earp, who needed a job, needed money, and didn't care what he did, it was a way to make money. It was pretty decent money. So he had some money in his pocket. He was deputy marshal of Wichita, and then a call came from, or a telegram came from the new mayor of Dodge City saying, would you consider coming to Dodge City being a lawman? And by this point, Wyatt's brother, another one of Wyatt's brothers, and his wife had settled in Dodge City, and they were running a business there that was doing very well. All right, it was a brothel, but in those days, you know, those were semi-legitimate businesses. So he said, okay, I guess I'll move there, and he ended up going to Dodge City. And now I'm going to rewind a little bit to Bat Masterson. Bat Masterson, the story that Bat always allowed to be told about him during his life was he too was born in Illinois. And the reason why he did that is because Bat was elected several times to federal positions, to office. He held positions as like federal U.S. Deputy Marshal, a federal position. So he didn't want it known that he was Canadian. Bat was born in Quebec. And his family, he was one of, let's see, there were 5 Masterson brothers and I think 3 Masterson sisters. So the family moved gradually across the border to New York, and New York to here, and New York to there. And they ended up settling a farm about 12 miles north of Wichita. And Bat was the second oldest boy. His brother Ed was older by a year and a half. But Bat always took care of his brother Ed. Ed was sort of like a mild-mannered, let's reason things out kind of guy, where Bat was, let me size up the situation. If action is needed, let's take it, get it over with. So Bat convinced Ed, when they were still teenagers, let's go buffalo hunting because that's where the money is. And they did. And it was on one of their trips that Bat and Wyatt first encountered each other. And they sort of hit it off right away. They didn't get to spend much time with each other because they were going in different directions. Bat and his brother Ed did buffalo hunting for a year or so. And then Bat got an offer to go to work as an Army scout. So he took the offer, and he had 2 adventures that started, he was only like 18, 19, establishing his reputation as a resourceful, courageous, persistent kind of guy with a strong constitution. One was he and some others were guarding a group of buffalo hunters and businessmen who were going down to Texas to a place called Adobe Walls to set up a settlement camp there where they could sell things to buffalo hunters. They were taking basically, it was like a pop-up store, you know, in the Adobe Walls area. What they didn't realize was that this area was claimed by the Comanche. And the Comanche at that time were led by Quanah Parker. Now that name might be familiar to a few of you who may have read the book Empire of the Summer Moon. That book was about Quanah Parker, the half-white, half-Comanche, leader of the Comanche. And one morning, he and his Comanche attacked the Adobe Wall settlement, and this very fierce fight went on for hours, in which Bat distinguished himself not only as a marksman, but in hand-to-hand combat. They eventually fought off a wounded Quanah Parker and established a settlement there. And word got around, boy, this is a tough guy to fight. You want him on your side. The other thing that happened was a band of Indians had captured a family of parents and 4 sisters who, you know, ill-advisedly were on a wagon that was making its way across Kansas, eventually to get to Colorado. The parents were killed, the sisters were captured, and the band of Indians split up into 2 bands, each one taking 2 captive sisters with them. And Bat, who was still an Army scout, decided, I am going to get those girls back. And off he went. And it took him a long time following the trail of one band and trying to track down those sisters. In fact, partly the story of The Searchers, which some of you are familiar with the John Wayne movie, is yes, it's based on the story of the Parker family, but also on Bat Masterson spending all this time, the wind and rain and snow and everything else. He finally finds one band, gets the two girls back. He sets off after the other, gets those two girls back, reunites the sisters who eventually are returned to their extended family. So again, another reputation for Bat Masterson. But he's tired after all this. So he decides there's a place it was called at the time Mobeetie, Texas, in the Panhandle. And they had a couple of saloons there, and Bat always liked to gamble. He decides, I'm going to park myself here and gamble for a bit and relax and just enjoy the life there, which he does. And there's a saloon girl named Molly Brennan, and Bat falls in love. And the feelings are reciprocated. So unfortunately, Molly had this Sergeant King, who was a U.S. Cavalry sergeant, who had a crush on Molly also. He also was a very mean alcoholic. And he had a gun, so that's a bad combination. One night, Sergeant King is staggering down the street of Mobeetie, and he looks in the window of a saloon, and there's Bat and Molly dancing together. He is enraged. He dashes into the first open door, dashes into the saloon, takes out his gun, and shoots Bat. Gets him right in the groin. So Bat is staggering, staggering, and Sergeant King sees he hasn't killed him. He says, okay, I'm going to shoot him again. And he goes to shoot him again. Molly throws herself in front of Bat, takes the bullet, and is killed. On his way to the floor, Bat gets his gun out and kills Sergeant King. Bat should have died. He's bleeding profusely, but they managed to put him back together, and they eventually got him up to the Masterson family farm, where he spent several months convalescing. And then one of his brothers by this point is in Dodge City and says to Bat, come on to Dodge City. It's a growing town. It's an exciting town. There's all kinds of interesting things happening here. So one day, Bat Masterson, he had to use a cane for the rest of his life, limps into town. In fact, one of the legends about Bat Masterson is he got his name Bat because he used his cane to bat people over the head. And while he may have done that, he already had the nickname Bat because his real name was Bartholomew Masterson. And his younger siblings could not pronounce Bartholomew, so they just shortened it to the first three letters of his name, so he's always known as Bat Masterson. So he comes limping into town on his cane, and he encounters his old friend Wyatt Earp. Wyatt says, I hear you've got a good reputation, and I know you're a good man. Could you use a job? Bat says, sure. Okay, well, I'm the deputy of so-and-so, I'm going to make you my deputy. And that was the beginning of Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp as lawmen in Dodge City. Why did they need lawmen? And that's where I did give you a little bit of information about Dodge City at that time. When the railroad, Texas obviously had a lot of cattle, and they needed, after the Civil War, needed to get them up to where they could be shipped somewhere, to the slaughterhouses and wherever. And Dodge City was the perfect location once the railroad came in 1872. Because you could go across the Panhandle, go across into southern Kansas, there's Dodge City, you sell your cattle, you put them on the trains, off they go, everybody makes money. What happened when that took place was that you had all these cowboys with money in their pocket who had just been on this dusty, dry trail for 6, 8, 10 weeks. They wanted to party. Wine, women, and song. And so suddenly Dodge City went from basically this one saloon backwater place to where they were erecting saloons, they were erecting bordellos, they were erecting all kinds of dry goods stores, rural theaters and everything. And so to entertain the cowboys. And everybody right away was making all kinds of money because the cowboys were, what would take them 6 or 8 weeks to earn, they were spending in 3 or 4 days. And then they'd head back to Texas to get another cattle drive. The problem is, again, the combination of rowdy cowboys, guns, and alcohol created a lot of violent situations. People were literally just shooting and killing each other in the street. Boot Hill got his name because these two cowboys, drunken cowboys, were on top of a hill, got into an argument, one killed the other, just left him there, and got off the hill. So when somebody went up there again, they just dug a hole and buried him there. That became the town cemetery, Boot Hill, because they found the cowboy with his boots on stilts, pointing straight up. So the city fathers in Dodge City decided that they were going to hire a marshal, which they did. They made a mistake of hiring a guy named Bully Brooks, who was really a psychopath. And he decided the way to bring law and order to Dodge City is kill the bad guys faster than they kill each other. So he killed about a dozen of them, in his first few months in office. Then the business people realized this is not a good strategy. They fired him. He had made so many friends in Dodge City that soon after they fired him, the crowd got together and dragged him out of the city limits and lynched him. So then they hired another marshal to come in. Now this marshal basically was a good administrator. He wasn't the kind that's going to patrol the streets. So he and the mayor are the ones who contacted Wyatt, come to be the deputy marshal. Bat Masterson becomes Wyatt's deputy. Eventually, two Masterson brothers would join the police force. Eventually, Virgil Earp and Morgan Earp would join the police force at various times. So you had these two families, frontier families, the Earps and the Mastersons, the two groups of brothers, who were combining their efforts to try and tame Dodge City. And it's interesting, one of these aspects is that these were young men. There were no police academies in those days. There was nothing to teach them how to do policing. There was no one. They were not formally educated men, but they spontaneously decided that there was a goodness in them, and there was a goodness to Dodge City, and they wanted to be on the right side of the law, and they wanted to enforce the law. So that's what they did, and that's what so much of the book is about: enforcing the law, trying to turn Dodge City from a violent, anything goes, wickedest town in the American West, which is what the subtitle is. There's a story in the book. The reputation Dodge City had. The guy's on a train, and he's looking pretty down in the dumps, and the conductor goes over to him and says, "Where you going, buddy?" And the guy says, "I'm going to hell." And the guy says, "Well, that'll be $2 to get off at Dodge City." That's the kind of reputation it had. And so over the years, Wyatt and Bat, having each other's back, patrolled the streets. There were other lawmen and their brothers with them. And this book is filled with stories about their adventures, including a lot of the characters that late became well known, associated with the American West, were connected to Dodge City in one way or another, because Dodge City was like the hub of the frontier. So you have stories in here, stories that could be verified, because there's a lot of stuff that didn't make the book that just couldn't be verified. A lot of the legends that made it into Hollywood movies didn't happen. But you had the James brothers that came to Dodge City. In fact, Bat Masterson and Frank James corresponded until Frank James died, like in 1915 or something like that. You had Belle Starr, the famous female outlaw. She came to town one day and walked in with 6 guns and just held up an entire saloon. You have outlaws like Clay Allison. You have Dirty Dave Rudabaugh. You have Mysterious Dave Mather. Dirty Dave hooked up with Billy the Kid. And there's a whole story about him, how Wyatt Earp was in pursuit of Dirty Dave, who was specialized in train robbery. And he robbed a couple of trains and then was making his way for Texas, and Wyatt set off on his own to track down Dirty Dave and his group and his band, which included Billy the Kid. They were eventually captured by Pat Garrett. But he got to this saloon in Texas, this little saloon in Texas, and he goes to the saloon owner. "Anybody seen Dirty Dave or his band?" He said, "I don't think so, but ask that guy, the part player over there, who's been sitting there for days." He goes and sits down there. It's Doc Holliday. That was the first time Wyatt and Doc met each other, long before Tombstone. Was that day in this little town in Texas in this saloon, and somehow they hit it off. I mean, Doc was not a very likable guy. He was drunk a lot. He was mean. He was nasty. But something about him, Wyatt said, "I guess if I could be friends with this guy, I could be friends with anybody." And when Wyatt got up to leave, he said, "Listen, I'm lawman in Dodge City. You ever need help, you come see me." And sure enough, not that long after, Doc's playing cards with somebody who cheats. There's a fight. Doc kills him. Doc gets arrested. The town didn't have a jail, so they put him on the second floor of his hotel. And this mob gets together because Doc, like I said, was not a likable guy to begin with. They said, "Why should we wait a couple of weeks for the justice of the peace to get to town? Let's settle it now. Let's do our own justice." So they're going to lynch Doc. Now, Doc fortunately had a girlfriend there called Big Nose Kate Elder. And again, you can make this stuff up, but you don't have to. It's based on facts. So Big Nose gets wind of this. And so she grabs a couple of horses and she starts heading for the hotel. She has a very bright idea. She's passing by a stable. She sets fire to it. Remember, these towns are made of wood. You have to stop everything you're doing, because if you don't put this fire out, the whole town goes up. So the lynch mob is on its way. Oh my God, the stable's on fire. So they immediately form a bucket brigade and forget about Doc. So Kate gets over to the hotel. She's underneath the window. Doc jumps out, gets onto the horse. They hightail it to Dodge City. And that's where they would spend the next couple of 2-3 years with Doc and Wyatt having all kinds of adventures, like I say, long before gunfight at the OK Corral. And Doc and Bat sort of became friends because Bat didn't like Doc very much either, but he was Wyatt's friend, so he's going to be my friend. And there's adventures. There's even one, the Royal Gorge War, where that Bat is hired to form a posse to fight for on the side of one of the railroads, and he invites Doc to go along. So you have stories in the book about all these outlaws and various colorful people that are coming through, and confrontations that they have. There's one story in the book when Clay Allison, who was one of the meanest of the outlaws, he comes to Dodge City because he believed that Wyatt had shot one of his friends. It may or may not have been true, but he confronts Wyatt. But what he does is he gets a couple of 3 cowboys lurking in the doorway with guns. He said, "Listen, I'm going to take care of Wyatt Earp, but just in case I don't, so something goes wrong, you shoot him. Don't let him see you, but you shoot him. I don't want Wyatt Earp to live this day." Okay. So he confronts Wyatt Earp in the street, and suddenly Clay Allison's meeting for the first time, and he's seeing that Wyatt Earp is not some typical lawman. Wyatt, without any fear in him, is staring right back at him. He's got his gun on. Clay Allison says, "You know what? I don't know if I can take this guy." So Clay says, "I think it's time. I'm gonna head out of town, see what's going on in the next town." Wyatt Earp says, "That's a good idea." And then Clay calls to the cowboys and says, "Okay, fellas, put your guns down." And another voice rings out and says, "That's a good idea, fellas." It turns out Bat Masterson with a shotgun had those cowboys covered. That's how they worked together. They always had each other's back. One didn't necessarily go alone. But there's this one thing that happened. So they were very successful in that killings were down, schools were being built, churches were being built. There was a civilization coming to Dodge City. Farms were springing up. It was a place that people they stopped dreading going there. They actually saw Dodge City as a place of opportunity. But there was still one thing that happened that showed that it was in 1878 that Dodge could still revert to its old ways. By this time they had imposed, Bat Masterson was sheriff by this point, and the marshal of Dodge City was Ed Masterson, his older brother, the mild-mannered one. And Wyatt was on, I think this is when Wyatt was on this posse trying to find Dirty Dave Wunderbaum. You couldn't bring a gun into the city limits. So one night, Ed on his patrol, he hears gunfire going off in one of the saloons. And he goes to investigate. Sure enough, there's 5 cowboys there, 2 of them have guns, and they're just firing at the ceiling. And Ed says, "Listen, can't do that. Give the guns to the bartender. When you leave town, he can get them back." They're reluctant to give up their guns, but they do it. Ed said, "Thank you, appreciate that." He leaves the saloon. And a few seconds later, you hear footsteps behind them, and coming out of the saloon are 5 cowboys, and 2 of them have their guns back again. So Ed goes up to them and confronts them and says, "You got to give me those guns now. No guns allowed at Dodge City." So the one cowboy takes the gun, puts it up against Ed, and fires. Mortally wounds him. He was so close that his vest goes on fire. Now somebody had run to Bat's, a little bit earlier, had run to Bat's sheriff's office and said, "Bat, your brother might be in trouble. You might want to come running." Bat puts his guns on. He comes running, rounds the corner, and he sees his brother mortally wounded, his vest on fire, staggering down the street, and the 5 cowboys there, the 2 of them with guns. Now, Bat had pledged to uphold the law, but for the one time he broke. He couldn't. It broke him. He take his guns out, shot both cowboys. Took care of them. And he was going to shoot the other 3 guys, cowboys, but he saw they weren't armed, and he sort of resisted. He said, "I am wearing a badge. I can't shoot unarmed men." So he arrested the other 3 guys who eventually went to trial. And it was the biggest funeral Dodge City ever saw, was when Ed Masterson was laid to rest, and not Boot Hill, because that was for bad guys. One of the signs of Boot Hill for a guy who got shot was he died of lead poison. They buried Ed Masterson, and Bat continued as sheriff, but eventually, as the town became, other lawmen took their places. These were restless young men. They wanted to, let's see what the rest of the world is like. And Wyatt took off. He and his 3rd wife decided to wander west. They had gotten notes from, Wyatt had 4 wives, some of them overlapped. He had a very complicated domestic situation. So he and his 3rd wife eventually made their way to Tombstone, where he met his 4th wife, while married to his 3rd wife. And he said he had met up with his brothers in Tombstone, and we know the story that eventually there was a gunfight at the OK Corral. And after that, Morgan was killed, Berger was badly wounded, and so Wyatt and Doc, and another Earp brother, went on what was known as the Earp Vendetta. He tracked down the guy, so he killed his brother. And it's interesting, when he was done, he was just very spent, exhausted, sick with himself for the violence he had participated in. And where did he go? He looked up back in Colorado, his best friend. You know, take me in, you know, and help restore me, basically. That's what happened. Wyatt eventually, with his fourth wife, started to wander. He left Arizona, they wandered to Mexico, Nevada, California. They even ended up in Alaska. He ran a saloon in Alaska for a couple of years. Came back down to California, lived in San Diego for 3 or 4 years. Wyatt Earp, you know, who became the most famous lawman, and you'd think that the lifespan would not be that good. He lived till 80. And in fact, his last years, he was living in Hollywood, and he was making some money as a technical advisor, a consultant to a young director of silent westerns named John Ford. And so eventually, years later, Ford's homage to Wyatt was My Darling Clementine, his version of the OK Corral. And Wyatt died at 80. Now, Bat had this whole other act. When he left Dodge City, he was working as a lawman in other towns in Colorado, and during one of his stints, he was covering, as a U.S. federal marshal, he was covering the Dakotas, and he met this young rancher from New York City, young guy who had left New York City to try his hand as a rancher in the Dakotas for a couple of years, and his name was Theodore Roosevelt. And they became good friends. Now, Roosevelt eventually went back to New York City, became police commissioner, of course, as we know, Cuba, and then became president. Bat was working as the manager of a vaudeville theater in Colorado when this musical troupe came along. And he had his eye on this young singer and dancer there named Emma, and fell in love. It was reciprocated. So Bat, for the first time, fell in love years and years after the unfortunate death of Molly Brennan. And he and Emma were married for the next 30-something years for the rest of Bat's life. And what was the rest of Bat's life? Well, when Bat turned 50, there was a reputation about Bat, and he wrote his friend the president, because Roosevelt was president by this time, and said, I'm really nervous that some young punk's going to come along and shoot me to make his own reputation, because he could advertise, I shot Bat Masterson. So the president wrote back and said, you know what, why don't you take a break from out there, come to New York, I will make you the deputy U.S. Marshal for New York. Okay, sounds good to me. He and his wife got on a train, they come to New York, and he does that for a couple of years, allows him to carry his Colts and everything like that. And then this fellow approaches him, Joseph Lewis, who is the publisher of the New York World Telegram. And he said, because Bat always dabbled in writing. He actually published articles in newspapers and magazines and stuff, and his reminiscences of Doc Holliday and other people. And he said, listen, why don't you be a newspaper man, work for my newspaper. Bat spent the next 15 years of his life as a New York City reporter and columnist. He could cover his 3 favorite things that began with B: boxing, baseball, and Broadway. And he would be out in the town, he'd go to plays, he'd go to baseball games, he'd go to boxing matches, he'd write them up in his column. His column became enormously popular. He became a celebrity in New York. And he would hold court every night as his daily activities were done. He would collect material for his columns. And one of his favorite saloons was on 44th and Broadway. And he would hold court there and tell stories. And, I should mention, one of his proteges at the World Telegram, a young reporter who looked up and admired Bat tremendously, was a reporter named Damon Runyon. And so years later, Damon Runyon would write the stories that became Guys and Dolls, right? What's the main character's last name? Sky Masterson. That was his tribute to his man he worshipped, Bat Masterson, who taught him everything he knew about being a newspaper reporter. But Bat would hold court there at the saloons. This one particular saloon was his favorite. And every so often you get some roof from out of town who would come into the saloon, realize he's there with the great Bat Masterson, the tamer of the West, who carries a Colt 6-shooter in his pocket, in his holster, with 26 notches on it for every outlaw he killed. None of it's true, but, Bat would wink and tell stories, and he's having a good time. He's a very popular guy. So every so often, one of these guys would say, Bat, sell me your gun. What do you want for it? Because just imagine, when I get back to Pennsylvania, Ohio, or Maryland, wherever I'm from, and I've got Bat Masterson's gun that tamed the West, that killed 26 outlaws. They'll elect me as mayor, I'll find a girlfriend, whatever. And so Bat would say, no, I can't do that, I can't do that, I can't do that, until the price got high enough. They'd agree on a price, and Bat would say, listen, but you have to leave town right away, the next train, because I can't let you be telling anybody else that all these other people I've said no to, I said yes to you, I'm a riot on my hands. Okay, Bat, I'm out of here. The exchange was done, the guy's on the train, he's gone, next day, Bat goes to his favorite pawn shop, buys a Colt, puts 26 notches on it, takes it right back in his pocket. Bat and Emma had a wonderful time in New York City together, and Bat died what some journalists may consider the ideal death. He was sitting in his newspaper office that day, it was about noon. He had just finished the last sentence of his most recent column. He basically just typed 30 at the bottom of it, slumped over, dead on his typewriter. There was a huge funeral in New York. Cowboy stars like Tom Mix were pallbearers. And he's buried in the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. And his wife, when she died, is buried next to him. So next time if you have a hankering to go to the Woodlawn Cemetery, you can find that at Emma Masterson. I want to read, again, I'm going to read the last paragraph here. And the connection to the first one is, it's the last paragraph of the book. And I find it kind of sweet and poignant because it's a trip that Bat took late in life, years after he left Dodge City, when he was working for the newspaper in New York. And he notices something he never gave himself credit for, how he had made about this change. So there's a real, Bat's an older man writing this, and he's, a big Broadway celebrity in a sense because he covers the Broadway. But there's a real kind of innocence to it. It's just the one paragraph. And some of you will notice the connection, which is the first paragraph of the book begins with Bat on a train coming into Dodge City. The last paragraph is Bat on a train coming into Dodge City. In 1910, there had been one last visit to Dodge City. Bat was returning from covering the boxing battle between Jack Johnson and Jim Jeffries in Reno, Nevada. On a July morning, the train steamed through southwest Kansas. Bat would later write in his newspaper column that during the last leg of the trip, down the Arkansas River Valley from Pueblo to Dodge City, seeing the vast grass-filled prairie he had first witnessed 4 decades earlier. Quote, I could not help wondering at the marvelous change that had come over the country in the last 20 years. As I looked from the car window, I saw in all directions groves of trees, orchards, and fields bearing abundant crops of corn, wheat, and alfalfa. The idea that the plains of western Kansas could ever be made fertile was something I had never dreamed of. So I think there's a real innocence to that. He and Wyatt and people who worked with them and how they made this transition take place on the American frontier and made the American frontier a safer place for people to live and continue their westward manifest destiny journey. So I'm going to take your questions in a second. I want to mention there's obviously copies here. The books are $30, but library patrons get them for $20. I'm happy to inscribe them and sign them if anybody wants any. But that's my talk, and I'm happy to accept any questions. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that Masterson was Canadian. Did he ever acquire American citizenship?
Not that I'm aware of. He never mentioned it, and
The president appointed him.
well, the president probably had believed that Bat was born in Illinois. And in those days, he didn't have to worry about ICE, and any morning raids, let's get this illegal immigrant out of here. To anything, I could not in any of the research read anything where Bat actually went to a courthouse or any kind of government office and said, swear me in as an American citizen. It just didn't seem important, I guess. As long as nobody knew about it. Yes?
Can you repeat the
Yes,
question?
did any of the cowboys and others go from Dodge City to Tombstone? There were cowboys in Tombstone, but there wasn't nearly as much of a cattle trade in Arizona, even though Tombstone was close to the Mexican border, as there was in Texas. Most of the cattle trade were these tens of thousands of herds of cattle that the Texas ranchers grew on their ranches, going all the way down to the border with Mexico, and they brought them up And for years, they would put them in the cow towns of Kansas because the railroad was there first. Arizona was years later to get the railroad. In fact, there's a journey that Doc Holliday takes, that's talked about in the book, where he was going down to a place in Arizona, and he got only so far, and that was the end of the railroad. You know, he still had more traveling to go, but he could only go by stagecoach. So there were cowboys in Arizona, but it wasn't the abundant amount of them that was in the Kansas cow towns. So, yes, sir.
Don't I remember correctly that when Wyatt and Bat kind of at their heyday in Dodge City, that there were other journalists and writers who were kind of penning these dime novels about them? And how did they relate to that? And how did they react to that sort of?
You know, that sort of came afterwards because, I mean, there's a story in the book, and one of the enduring legends about Wyatt Earp in Dodge City is that a writer named Ned Buntline in 1876 came to Dodge City because he heard about the great police force there, Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and Charlie Bassett, and a couple others, and he came to present them with Buntline specials, these specially made Colt revolvers with long barrels on them. And to this day, that has persisted as that actually happened. In fact, if you look at the Kurt Russell movie with Val Kilmer as Doc Holliday, for example, Tombstone, Wyatt Earp is using one of these long barrel things. Well, first of all, no such pistol was ever manufactured by the Colt Company. In 1876, Wyatt and Bat were certainly not making national headlines. And Ned Buntline never got as far west as Dodge City. So these are the kind of things you have to separate fact from fiction. There were, yes, they were starting to write, but Ned Buntline was one of the prime movers and shakers in the dime store novel industry, where they would crank out, they would just take a character from the West and just make up these stories and crank them out and sell them for, they would sell for a dime at the drugstore. So it was years after Dodge City that they, especially after Tombstone, that they would write these novels about Wyatt Earp and to a lesser extent about Bat Masterson. One of the reasons why Wyatt, who always hoped that he would find a way to get rich and never found it, that he didn't make a lot of money in his later years, is that you had writers approaching him saying, I want to write this story, I'm going to put this in it and that in it. And Wyatt said, but that didn't happen. No, that didn't happen. That's not the way it happened. So he kept refusing to cooperate with these writers, which could have been actually put some good money in his pockets. He just refused to tell falsehoods as far about his life. So, yes.
Tom, can you just tell us a little bit about where you did all your how you got all this material, where you did your research, etc.?
Well, it's a good or bad thing that a lot has been written about Wyatt Earp over the decades, starting with Wyatt Earp, Frontier Lawman, which came out in 1932, 3 years after Wyatt died. But a lot of these books either contain embellishments or absolute fabrications. So what I had to do was take a lot of the books that have been written and material written about Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and Dodge City, and try and go back in time, so to speak, to closer and closer to the actual sources. So thankfully, there are pretty solid archives available, the Dodge City Times and the Ford County Globe, both of which started publishing in the 1870s. So if a book says that Clay Allison came to Dodge City in 1880 to confront Wyatt Earp, I found the article from 1878 where Clay Allison came to town, and the stories about Clay Allison confronting Wyatt Earp. So not that you had Pulitzer Prize-winning reporters working for these papers, but at least they were writing about, in real time, so to speak, events as they were happening. So the newspaper archives were very, very helpful. There's been some really good in more recent years scholarship. You might think a magazine like True West is just sheer entertainment, but it's a wonderful magazine, but it's really fact-checked very well. So if you have somebody who's writing about Doc Holliday's days in Dodge City and focusing on that, it's a lot of the material is corroborated. There's a lot of fact-checking going on. You have some really good scholarship that's being done in recent years that they didn't bother with years ago. They just wanted to tell the fabrication of the more sensational story. So it's really just a matter of cast a wide net.
Yeah.
And the way I sort of think of it was, how you had the gold prospectors. They would spend all day sifting through the sand, and maybe at the end of the day you'd have a couple of gold nuggets. That's sort of the way the research was. You sift through a lot of sand, And at the end of the day, you hope there's a gold nugget or two you actually don't feel embarrassed to write.
Did you do it at a physical location or online? How did you access all this?
Both. I mean, the Kansas City Historical Society has great archives in Topeka, for example. There's a lot of online resources, thankfully. There's a book I'm working on now that's focusing on George Washington at Valley Forge. And you get everything George Washington ever wrote, you can get online now through the Library of Congress. Yeah, if you want to go to Mount Vernon or the University of Virginia, go for it. If you want to actually see some of the actual real parchment that he wrote on. But everything George Washington wrote, you can get through the internet, which is a luxury that wasn't available even as recently as probably 5 or 6 years ago. So it really helps somebody, yeah.
How long did it take you to write?
I think this was about 2.5 years, and each book is a different animal. The Heart of Everything That Is was a 4-year project. This was a 2.5-year project, and it's a combination of, it was a more focused story. It was focusing on Dodge City and mainly those 2 principal characters, not as much of a sweep of American West as the other book was. And the other thing inevitably was, what kind of deadline do you have? Your publisher will, for marketing and other purposes, they determined with some kind of algorithm that mystifies me, when the optimum time during a year for the book to come out. So I was told, we really want this book to come out the end of February, beginning of March of 2018. And you sort of backtrack because they want to have a manuscript in hand no later than 10 months before publication. So you realize, okay, I don't have 3 years. I don't have 3.25 years. I've got 2.5 years. Get to work. So that's, but I love the story, and it is a lot of stories. When you're writing about a lot of stories, time goes pretty quickly. It's not like it's not beats digging ditches. Yes, sir.
Tom, is there any history in your findings that show Wyatt or Bat Masterson in Wyoming, the Cheyenne Laramie area? And if I can ask you
Sure.
a follow-up, please. The Hole in the Wall gang, which Cassidy and Sundance did, did they ever, was that the same time frame, or?
I think that came later, as far as the Dodge City days.
Right.
I believe both Wyatt and Bat, maybe not necessarily together, spent some time in Cheyenne because in its early days, Cheyenne was a popular gambling destination. And it was also a destination for people who were going further north and west to the gold fields. There had been gold discovered, especially in Montana. Nevada City, I think in Montana, was a gold destination. So Cheyenne was a place that people would go to, and sometimes it was a place that they would leave to go someplace else, or it was a place that they would stay for a while, do some gambling, and then I'll go back, like Wyatt would do some gambling and during slow times in Dodge City, and then it would be time, once the cattle drives picked up again, it was time to go back to work. So. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you mentioned that Wyatt lived to be 80.
Yes.
How old was that when he wrote his last article?
He was a month before his 68th birthday. So now you think, oh gosh, he died, he was almost 68, that's too young. In 1921, which is when he died, both he and Wyatt pretty generously exceeded the average life expectancy for the average American male at that time. So probably in the 1920s for the American male was probably still some in the 50s maybe, the average lifespan. So Bat lived almost 68. So neither one of them really got cheated, and they lived full lives. Bat enjoyed the saloon. He enjoyed the cigars, the gambling, the drinking. He packed a lot of life into almost 68 years. So, all right. If you don't have any more questions, I will be right over here.